Imagine a world where gods walked among mortals, where every thunderclap was thought to be the voice of Zeus, and every whisper of the sea belonged to Poseidon. We know the familiar stories, the mighty Olympians, the Trojan War, the labors of Hercules. Yet beyond those well-worn tales lies another Greece, one almost erased by time, a Greece of forgotten myths, whispered only in fragments of poetry, scratched onto fading pottery, or hidden in the shadows of later retellings. Why did some stories endure, while others were silenced? Why do we celebrate the battles of Achilles, yet rarely speak of the gods who fell into obscurity? What do these lost legends reveal about how the ancient Greeks truly saw the world, and themselves? According to tradition, the people of early Hellas didn't imagine a single, fixed pantheon. Their gods shifted with the mountains and seas, shaped by local beliefs, by trade, by the memory of older cultures. The Greece we picture, marble temples and 12 Olympians, is only one version. In the centuries before, there were dozens of others, mysterious deities who ruled the night sky, guardians of rivers, even forgotten mothers of creation who once stood above Zeus himself. Archaeologists still uncover traces of these older powers. A shard of pottery showing a goddess with wings of fire, an inscription that names a god of silence, a figure never mentioned in Homer. These fragments suggest a vast constellation of myths, most of which have slipped through history's net, and yet they survive in echoes. A proverb passed down through generations, a festival with no clear origin, a strange custom once practiced on a lonely island, dismissed by later Greeks, but rooted in beliefs far older than we realize. The promise of this journey is simple. For the next hours, we'll step into that twilight space between memory and myth. We'll listen to the forgotten voices of the Greek world, gods who have no temples, heroes who left no epic, symbols whose meanings blurred across time. We'll see how these stories reflect not only the hopes and fears of an ancient people, but the very human need to explain mystery, to shape chaos into meaning. Because every myth, even the ones nearly lost, carries a seed of truth about what it meant to be alive thousands of years ago. And in rediscovering them, we may discover something about ourselves. To understand how these myths were born, we must first step back into the landscape of ancient Greece. Not the Greece of polished marble and grand theaters, but the raw, rugged land of 1,000 fragmented valleys, islands, and coastlines. This was a place carved by mountains, where villages were separated by steep ridges, and where the sea acted both as a barrier and a bridge. Geography was destiny, and it shaped the gods as much as it shaped the people. In the fertile plains of Thessaly, story spoke of sky gods who controlled storms and fertility. On the rocky islands of the Aegean, sea deities held power, demanding respect from sailors who faced the unpredictable waves. In the forests of Arcadia, myths told of wild spirits, half human and half beast, who guarded the balance between civilization and wilderness. Each community, each valley, each island carried its own variations of myth, local deities who may never have been known beyond their borders. Before Homer, before Hesiod, before the later poets fixed the myths into epic form, these stories were fluid. They lived in song, in ritual, in festivals that blended belief with daily survival. Farmers looked to local gods for rain. Shepherds prayed to rustic spirits for protection. Mothers told their children of watchful deities who punished dishonor and rewarded kindness. These myths were not entertainment. They were survival guides, moral lessons, and cultural memory woven into a single thread. Trade brought new influences. Crete, with its Minoan traditions, introduced powerful goddesses of fertility and nature. The Mycenaean palaces preserved tablets with names of deities both familiar and strange. Zeus appears, but so too does a shadowy figure called Duijo, a precursor lost in time. Contact with Egypt and the Near East introduced other motifs: serpent gods, cosmic eggs, primordial waters. The Greeks did not invent their myths in isolation. They inherited, reshaped, and absorbed ideas from a wide circle of civilizations. And yet, something uniquely Greek emerged. Unlike the distant gods of Egypt or the abstract divinities of Mesopotamia, Greek deities were strikingly human. They argued, they fell in love, they plotted, they made mistakes. To the Greeks, The divine was not a separate sphere, but a mirror of mortal life, magnified. And this human quality made the myths both intimate and enduring. But we must remember, the Olympian 12, as later codified, were only the tip of the iceberg. Local shrines and folk rituals often preserved older powers that never made it into the great epics. A goddess of the winds worshipped only on one island, a cave spirit honored with offerings of honey, a hero who, in one valley, was remembered as a god, while elsewhere he was nothing more than a forgotten ancestor. These fragments remind us that the mythological world of Greece was not fixed. It was alive, constantly shifting, shaped by geography, trade, war, and the quiet persistence of local traditions. To trace the lost myths, we must follow these threads back, into villages, into mountains, into seas, to find the forgotten voices hidden beneath the grand stage of Olympus. Long before scribes etched words into clay, before poets wove epics into verse, myths lived in the human voice. They were told by the fire at night, sung in the fields during work, and carried from one generation to the next. The earliest Greek myths were not fixed stories, with a single version. They were living, breathing traditions that shifted with every storyteller, adapting to the moment, the audience, and the land itself. According to archaeologists, some of these myths trace their roots to the Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago. The Linear B tablets, the oldest written records in the Greek language, list names of deities that feel familiar and yet strangely distant. Zeus appears, but as Dewi. Hera is there, but her role is unclear. There are also figures who never survived into the later pantheon, a god of grain named Helios, and a goddess linked to the underworld, known only as Potnia. Their stories were likely told aloud in palaces and villages, but they were eventually overshadowed, absorbed, or forgotten. In many cases, myths existed as ritual first, story second. A spring festival may have honored the death and rebirth of a vegetation god. A dance around a fire may have symbolized the endless struggle of night and day. Only later were these rituals given narrative form, and from them grew the myths we know. In this way, mythology was less about fantasy and more about explaining the cycles of nature, giving meaning to the rhythms of life. There are hints that older, pre-Greek traditions, from the Minoans on Crete, from Anatolia across the Aegean, even from the Near East, blended into the stories that became Greek. The Great Mother, a powerful goddess figure, appears in many fragments of early Greek religion. Some scholars believe she is the ancestor of Demeter, others connect her to Gaia. In either case, she is a reminder that before Zeus ruled the heavens, it was the earth, the womb, and the cycle of fertility that commanded reverence. Yet oral tradition left behind only fragments. Unlike the polished poems of Homer, the oldest myths were never written in full. What survives comes to us in echoes, a proverb in Hesiod's verse that hints at an older story, a passing mention in a tragedy of a god no one else names, a strange cult title inscribed on a temple. Each is a window into a mythology that has mostly slipped away. And then came the poets, Homer, Hesiod, the lyric bards, who began to fix the stories into recognizable form. They selected, combined, and shaped traditions, weaving them into epics that reached beyond local villages and became pan-Hellenic. But in the process, countless local myths were left behind. The selection was not neutral. By choosing which gods to raise, which heroes to immortalize, the poets also chose which to silence. It is in those silences that the lost myths live. The gods who once received offerings, but never appeared in Homer. The heroes remembered in one valley, but ignored everywhere else. The primordial beings mentioned only once, then never again. These are the fragments we must trace, piecing together the hidden tapestry beneath the familiar surface of Greek mythology. When we think of Greek mythology, we imagine Zeus on his throne, Athena with her spear, or Apollo guiding the sun across the sky. But the deeper we look into the fragments of early tradition, the more we realize that these familiar names were only the survivors. Around them existed a constellation of figures who, for a time, were equally powerful, equally worshipped, and sometimes even more ancient. Take Nyx, the goddess of night. To most, she is little more than a shadow in Hesiod's Theogony. Yet according to certain traditions, she was among the first beings to exist. Born from chaos itself, Nyx was said to be so powerful that even Zeus feared her. She gave birth to concepts we still wrestle with: sleep, death, strife, and dreams. In some stories, she spread her wings across the cosmos, her darkness giving shape to the world of light. Though rarely mentioned in mainstream myth, her presence lingers as a reminder of an older cosmic order, one where night itself was a deity to be revered. Then there is Erebus, the embodiment of darkness. His name appears in early genealogies, but seldom in stories. Some accounts describe him not just as a primordial force, but as a place, the shadowed regions between Earth and the underworld. Together with Nyx, he fathered many of the world's mysteries. His absence from later myth is telling. As Greek thought evolved, the gods became more anthropomorphic, while abstract beings like Erebus were pushed into the background. Other forgotten figures include Eileithyia, an early goddess of childbirth. In later times she was seen as a daughter of Hera, but inscriptions suggest she may have been worshipped independently long before Hera rose to prominence. Women in labor prayed to her, and offerings were made to ensure safe delivery. Though largely overshadowed in later mythology, her cults endured for centuries, proof that myths did not live only in poetry, but in the most intimate aspects of daily life. Even within the Olympians, there are shadows. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, was once considered one of the central 12, yet later stories push her aside to make room for Dionysus. Unlike her siblings, Hestia had few myths. She represented stability, family, and the fire at the center of every home. In a culture fascinated with dramatic tales of war and love, a quiet goddess of the hearth did not inspire epic poetry. But in every household, her presence was real, and perhaps that is why her legend faded less spectacularly, slipping into ritual rather than story. Among heroes, too, we find forgotten names. Everyone remembers Achilles, Odysseus, or Perseus. Yet local traditions preserved figures like Iphiclos, a hero of Thessaly associated with healing, or Melicertes, a child who became a sea deity after tragedy struck his family. These heroes never reached the fame of Heracles, but for the people who honored them, they were just as significant. In a way, they embody the diversity of Greek myth, not a single canon, but thousands of local variations layered upon one another. What is striking is how many of these forgotten gods and heroes represent forces that were less glamorous, but deeply human. Night and darkness, childbirth and home. Local heroes, whose deeds mattered only to their own community. Their fading from popular memory is not a sign of weakness, but of a cultural shift toward the stories that resonated on a larger, pan-Hellenic scale. And yet, if we listen closely, their voices are still there. A broken inscription naming Eileithyia, a rare reference to Nyx in a later philosopher's work, a small festival on a lonely island where villagers still poured wine into the sea for Melicertes. These fragments remind us that mythology was not only the grand spectacle of Homer, but also the intimate faith of ordinary people. Among the quieter threads of Greek mythology lies the story of Hypnos and Thanatos, twin brothers born of Nyx, the goddess of night. Unlike their Olympian relatives, they did not command thunder or seas, but they ruled forces no mortal could escape: sleep and death. According to legend, Hypnos lived in a dark cave where no light or sound could enter. At its entrance bloomed fields of poppies and night-blooming flowers, whose scent lulled both gods and mortals into slumber. Beside him, his twin Thanatos waited with gentle patience. Where Hypnos closed eyes in rest, Thanatos closed them forever. To the Greeks, they were not enemies, but companions, two faces of the same truth. One tale describes how even the mighty Zeus was once deceived by these brothers. Hera, seeking to punish Heracles, asked Hypnos to lull Zeus into sleep so that her schemes could unfold without his interference. Hypnos hesitated. For the last time he had dared such a trick, Zeus awakened in fury and nearly crushed him with lightning. But Hera promised him gifts, even the hand of Pasithea, a goddess of relaxation and dreams. Tempted, Hypnos agreed. As Zeus reclined on Mount Ida, Hypnos spread his wings, touched the king of gods with sleep, and left him powerless. Hera unleashed her vengeance, while Hypnos fled to the underworld, taking refuge with his brother Thanatos until Zeus's anger cooled. This story, scattered in fragments across ancient texts, offers a striking lesson. Even the greatest god could be undone not by battle, but by the quiet inevitability of sleep. It reflects an older truth the Greeks understood well, that human life is ruled as much by rest and mortality as by power and glory. The myth does not glorify conquest. It humbles. Thanatos, though often overshadowed by Hades, carried his own stories. Unlike the monstrous visions of death in later cultures, Thanatos was not feared as cruel. He was described as calm, inevitable, sometimes even merciful. He arrived without malice, carrying mortals gently into the afterlife. In vase paintings, he is shown with wings, a quiet counterpart to the more violent spirits of war. For the Greeks, this vision of death was less terrifying and more a reminder of life's natural close. Together, Hypnos and Thanatos reveal a side of mythology that rarely made it into the epic stage. They were not warriors or rulers. They did not demand temples or empires. Instead, they embodied experiences every human shared, the drift into sleep, and the final silence of life. And yet, their presence in myth tells us much about the Greek view of existence. Death and sleep were not enemies to be conquered, but companions to be acknowledged. Even Zeus could not escape them. Even heroes must one day yield. It is a myth without a triumphal ending, without a heroic victory, and perhaps that is why it was never sung in epic halls. But for those who whispered it, the story carried a deeper wisdom, that in the stillness of night, both gods and mortals are equal. Among the stories that flicker at the edge of Greek mythology is the tale of Hecate, a goddess whose image shifts depending on where her worshippers lived. In later times, she became known as a mysterious figure of crossroads, torches, and night magic. But older traditions reveal a far wider role, suggesting she was once a far greater power than the Olympians themselves. According to Hesiod, Hecate was honored by Zeus above all, granted dominion over earth, sea, and sky. She was invoked in childbirth, in harvests, in battles, and in protection at sea. In some places, she was a radiant guardian, a bringer of prosperity. Yet in other traditions, she was feared as a liminal goddess, one who stood at the threshold between life and death, light and darkness. The regional differences are striking. In Thessaly, inscriptions call her a goddess of fertile fields, her blessings tied to the growth of crops. In coastal towns, sailors prayed to her for safe passage. Yet in Athens, her image was more unsettling. Shrines were placed at doorways and crossroads, places where the human world touched the unknown. Here she became associated with spirits of the restless dead, with unseen presences that lingered in the night. One version of her myth describes her as the only deity who aided Demeter in the search for Persephone. While other gods hesitated, Hecate lit her torches and guided Demeter through the underworld's dark passages. In this telling, she is not a goddess of fear, but of loyalty and light, helping a grieving mother. But another tradition casts her in a harsher role, not as a savior, but as a keeper of ghosts, commanding the shades of the dead who wandered at night. What is fascinating is how the same goddess could embody both comfort and dread. This duality suggests that Hecate preserved traces of very old beliefs, possibly from pre-Greek traditions. She may have originated as a mother goddess, later reshaped by local fears of the night and the underworld. Her myth became a mirror of the community that told it. In a farming village, she blessed the fields. In a port city, she guarded the seas. In urban Athens, she stood at the crossroads, where travelers hesitated and shadows deepened. Even her form changed. Early depictions show a single goddess, holding torches. Later art shows her with 3 faces or 3 bodies, facing in different directions. This image may have symbolized her power at thresholds, seeing past, present, and future, or watching over all directions at once. But it may also reflect the merging of separate local goddesses into one composite figure, her identity layered like a palimpsest of memory. Though Hecate survived into later times, much of her original grandeur was lost. By the Hellenistic era, she was reduced to a goddess of spells and witchcraft, feared more than revered. And yet, the fragments tell another story. that she was once honored as a cosmic power, a guide, and a protector. Her shifting myth is a reminder that there was no single Greece, no single canon of mythology. Each region told its own version, and the gods themselves were shaped by the needs and fears of their worshippers. What survived was not always what mattered most to the people of the time. And so, behind the famous names of Olympus, we glimpse shadowed figures like Hecate, gods who wore many faces, and whose forgotten stories reveal the complexity of belief in the ancient world. To the ancient Greeks, myths were never only about gods and heroes. They were woven with symbols, natural signs, and sacred objects that carried meaning across generations. Some were obvious, like thunderbolts for Zeus or the trident for Poseidon. But in the quieter, forgotten myths, the symbols are stranger, subtler, and often older than the Olympians themselves. Consider the serpent. In many local traditions, snakes were not simply creatures of fear, but sacred guardians of the earth. Some shrines kept live serpents, believed to be the physical forms of household spirits. One story tells of Glycon, a serpent god worshipped in northern Greece, said to bring healing and prophecy. Long before Apollo claimed the oracle at Delphi, it was guarded by a serpent, the dragon python, a symbol of the raw, untamed earth. To later poets, the serpent became a monster to be slain. But in older myths, it was a protector, an ancient force not easily subdued. Numbers also carried weight. The number 3 appears again and again in forgotten fragments. Hecate with 3 bodies, the 3 Moirai, or fates, spinning the thread of life. In older traditions, the number may have symbolized balance, past, present, future, or the natural triad of birth, life, and death. The Greeks did not invent this symbolism. They inherited it from earlier cultures, but they gave it a distinctly human cast, tying cosmic cycles to everyday existence. Objects, too, were more than props. The torch, for example, was not just a tool of light. In myths, it symbolized guidance through darkness, whether Hecate searching for Persephone, or local rituals, where torches were carried in processions to honor the gods. Similarly, honey appears again and again as a sacred offering. In rural festivals, honey was poured into the earth or given to chthonic deities, believed to feed the spirits of the underworld. To the Greeks, honey was not only food but a bridge between worlds, sweet, golden, and enduring. Animals that seem ordinary to us were once divine messengers. Owls, long before they became Athena's emblem, were linked with night wisdom and the watchful presence of unseen spirits. Dogs, often associated with Hecate, were thought to sense what humans could not. In some myths, their howling marked the passage of spirits between worlds. Even donkeys appear in cult rituals, humble creatures tied to fertility and the cycles of work that sustain communities. What is striking is how these symbols blur the line between myth and life. The serpent in the field, the honey poured at dawn, the owl seen at twilight. Each was both a real experience and a mythic sign. For the Greeks, the world itself was alive with messages. A bird in flight, a sudden storm, a dream after eating certain herbs, all could be interpreted as the voice of gods or spirits. In the great epics, these subtle signs fade into the background of drama and war. But in the forgotten myths, they take center stage. They remind us that for ordinary Greeks, mythology was not distant theater. It was lived experience, embedded in the symbols of nature, ritual, and daily survival. Every torch lit in the night, every snake glimpsed in the grass, every offering of honey, all were part of a larger language, one that spoke directly to the people of the time. And though we may not hear that language fully today, the fragments still whisper through the symbols that remain. Though many of these myths faded from written tradition, their echoes linger around us, not only in old ruins or dusty manuscripts, but in the words we speak, the customs we follow, and the stories we tell even today. Take language. Everyday expressions often carry shadows of ancient belief. The word hypnosis comes directly from Hypnos, god of sleep. Thanatology, the study of death, recalls his brother Thanatos. Even the word chaos traces back to the primordial void from which Nyx and Erebus were said to emerge. Without realizing it, we summon forgotten deities every time we use these terms. The myths may be gone, but their names still breathe through our vocabulary. Festivals, too, preserve fragments. The Eleusinian mysteries, though long suppressed, were once among the most sacred rites in Greece, centered on Demeter, Persephone, and perhaps Hecate. While the full rituals were never recorded, echoes of them survive in later harvest festivals across Europe, with torches, processions, and offerings to the earth. Even modern Halloween customs, the torchlight, the offerings left at doorways, the sense of a boundary between living and dead, bear faint resemblance to rituals once made in honor of chthonic gods. Architecture hides traces as well. At certain crossroads in Athens, archaeologists have found small shrines known as Hecate, where statues of Hecate once stood, guarding the thresholds. These locations were liminal, neither home nor wilderness, neither city nor road. Today, the statues are gone, but the crossroads remain, and with them the idea that some spaces carry unseen weight. In art and pop culture, the fragments surface more vividly. The goddess Nyx, long overlooked, has reappeared in modern fantasy, video games, and comics as a figure of power and mystery. Hecate has become an icon in literature, often tied to witchcraft and feminine power. Even the quiet symbols, the owl of wisdom, the serpent of rebirth, continue to populate stories, logos, and films. We may not know their ancient origins, but their resonance persists. The persistence of these echoes tells us something profound. Myths do not truly vanish. They adapt. They hide in words and customs, in images that outlive their original context. When a novelist names a character Nyx, when a scientist coins the term Erebos for a dark asteroid, when a child carries a torch in a harvest parade, the old stories flicker to life again, even if only faintly. In this way, forgotten myths are never fully lost. They live in cultural memory, waiting to be noticed. For the Greeks, these stories explain the mysteries of existence. For us, they remind us of continuity, that across thousands of years, humanity still looks to symbols, names, and stories to make sense of the unknown. When we step back and examine these myths through the lens of science and anthropology, something remarkable becomes clear. They were never simply stories. They were frameworks, ways for the human mind to order the chaos of existence. And even the forgotten myths, perhaps especially those, hold insights into how ancient people thought, feared, and hoped. Anthropologists remind us that myth is a mirror of environment. In the rugged mountains of Greece, where survival depended on weather, herding, and agriculture, myths emerged that explained those forces. Storm gods embodied the terror of sudden thunder. Grain goddesses expressed the anxiety and relief of harvest. Spirits of caves, rivers, and crossroads reflected the landscapes where people lived. To dismiss them as fantasy is to miss their practical role. They were tools of orientation in an unpredictable world. Psychology offers another layer. Carl Jung suggested that myths are expressions of archetypes, universal symbols born of the human psyche. The forgotten figures of Nyx, Hypnos, and Thanatos fit this pattern perfectly. Night, sleep, and death are not only external realities, they are inner experiences shared by every human being. By personifying them as deities, the Greeks externalized what they felt within. To them, sleep was not just biological, it was a god. Death was not just an end, it was a companion. From a historical perspective, the evolution of these myths shows the filtering of cultural memory. As Greece moved toward city-states and pan-Hellenic identity, the myths that unified people, like Zeus's supremacy or Athena's wisdom, were preserved, while local and intimate deities faded. This selection process mirrors the way cultures today elevate certain narratives while discarding others. What remains is not the truth of myth, but the version that served the dominant needs of society. Archaeology helps recover the silenced voices. Inscriptions mentioning forgotten gods, votive offerings left in caves, or unusual cult practices all point to the diversity of belief. A figurine of a winged goddess found far from any known sanctuary. A ritual cup etched with a name absent from Homer. Each discovery suggests that myth was more varied and fragmented than later texts reveal. The Olympians were not the whole story. They were simply the most enduring headline. Science also explains how symbols survive. The owl's connection to wisdom, the serpent to rebirth, the torch to guidance, These are not arbitrary. They resonate with natural observation. Owls see in darkness. Snakes shed their skin. Torches banish night. For the Greeks, these natural facts became sacred truths. For us, they remain powerful metaphors, still used in psychology, literature, and even branding. In this light, forgotten myths are not mistakes of history. They are vital pieces of evidence. They remind us that human imagination is not random. It follows patterns, responds to environment, and carries echoes across generations. When we study these lost tales alongside science, we do not weaken their power, we deepen it. We see how myth and reason, far from being opposites, have always danced together in shaping how we understand the world. So why do these forgotten myths matter? Why should we care about gods without temples, heroes without epics, and fragments that barely survived the erosion of time? The answer is that myths, even the lost ones, are not relics. They are reflections, mirrors of how people once faced the same questions we still carry today. What is life? What is death? How do we find meaning in the unknown? The Greeks answered with stories. Some of those stories became immortal, etched into art and poetry. Others faded, whispered only in villages, or inscribed on shards of clay. Yet together, they form a mosaic of the human spirit. Rediscovering them is more than an academic exercise. It reminds us that no culture, no civilization, is ever complete in the version that survives. History tends to favor the grand, the powerful, the voices that aligned with empire. But beneath that surface lies another history, quieter, more intimate, but no less important. The stories of Hecate guiding a grieving mother, of Hypnos humbling even Zeus, of serpents once honored as guardians, of goddesses of birth, of night, of silence. These are the human truths that rarely make it into the official record, but they remain as vital as the better-known tales. And in many ways, they speak to us even more clearly, because they are not about conquest or glory. They are about sleep, death, fertility, protection, thresholds, the everyday forces that shape every human life. They tell us that mythology is not only about heroes on battlefields, but also about the rhythms of nature, the cycles of family, and the mysteries we face alone in the dark. Today, we live in a world transformed by science and technology. We can map the stars, measure the heartbeat, decode the atom. Yet for all our progress, we still hunger for meaning. We still tell stories. We still reach for symbols to make sense of the unknown. The Greeks, with their forgotten myths, remind us that this impulse is ancient, and that in myth, as in science, we are simply trying to understand ourselves. So as we close this journey through the lost myths of ancient Greece, let us not see them as ghosts of a dead religion. Instead, see them as companions, quiet voices from the past that still have wisdom to share. They remind us to pay attention to the thresholds in our own lives, the crossroads where choices are made, the silences where understanding is born, the nights where dreams still guide us. Because in the end, mythology is not about gods. It is about us. The stories we tell, the symbols we choose, the echoes we carry. And in listening to the forgotten ones, we discover something timeless, that no myth is ever truly lost, as long as we are still willing to remember. If you want to hear the next forgotten legend, subscribe now, so you don't miss the story.